afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on Science is from Mars and Arts from Venus. When I read the title of today's session, I wondered, is housework from Pluto and climbing the corporate ladder from Jupiter? Is wiping a baby's bottom from Saturn and heading a law firm from Mercury? But moving away from these perhaps rather unhelpful planetary allusions, the crux of our discussion today hinges on the relationship that societies across the world seem to have developed between gender and certain disciplines, men and science and women and the arts. There's one important study that measured the association between math arts and male-female conducted over 1998 and 2010 with more than 500,000 people from around the world participating, and more than 70% of test takers more readily associated male with science and female with arts than the reverse. But can there be music without maths? Can there be astronomy without dreaming? Instinctively, of course, my answer is no. But then I thought a little bit about it. And, I thought about myself and how I'm a reasonably ambitious person and successful person, but how I have always instinctively preferred, say, cultural theory to calculus. And why was that? Was it bad teachers? Was it the home environment? Was it genetic? Was it my gender? This last question causes people to get quite angry and worked up and has got certain people into a lot of trouble for suggesting it. But it's certainly something that we're going to be tackling today with this wonderful panel. To discuss and deconstruct these conundrums, we have with us Priyamvada Natarajan, astrophysicist, professor in the departments of astronomy and physics at Yale University. Priyamvada is noted for her work in mapping dark matter and dark energy, particularly with her work in gravitational lensing and in models describing the assembly and accretion histories of supermassive black holes. So that should leave you feeling very enlightened indeed. She's authored the book Mapping the Heavens, which is a popular science book. We also have Humanities Dean Sharon Marcus, who's the Orlando Harriman Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, who specializes in 19th century British and French literature and culture. We have political theorist Uday Singh Mehta, a political philosopher at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, whose work encompasses a wide spectrum of philosophies, including the relationship between freedom and imagination, liberalism's complex link with colonialism and empire, and more recently, war, peace, and non-violence. In other words, life, the universe, and everything. We also have male science writer celebrities, Mukul Sharma and Stefan Kline. Mukul Sharma is the former editor of Science Today, and currently he writes a fortnightly column, Science and Spirituality, in the Times of India. He's also published several science fiction short stories, and his books include a textbook on computers, a collection of corny, softcore poems, and a collection of speculative fiction. And last but certainly not least, we have Stefan Kline, who's considered one of the most influential science writers in Europe. His 2002 book, The Science of Happiness, ranked on all major national bestseller lists, and his work has been translated into 27 languages. Priyamvada, I thought that we'd start with you. The theme for the entire festival is this man-woman thing. So tell us, do you feel like an intruder in a man's world?
Well, can you hear me now? Okay. Well, I wouldn't say that I feel like an intruder, but I definitely am in the minority. And intruder suggests that you don't belong there. I actually feel very much I belong there, but I'm definitely one of the few women in the game and what I do. And I understand why that is so, why it is that women are still a rarity in some of these disciplines. cosmology and mathematics in particular. Partly because the path, the track to getting on to be doing research at the highest levels, at the institutions which are traditionally the leading research universities, it's a real challenge. It's a challenge across universities that departments of physics and mathematics have. My own personal experience it's been very interesting. I grew up in India. I did my high school in India. So thankfully at the time, in India, if you were smart, you did the hard thing and you were the cool kids. And so it was a very interesting experience for me to go to the US, where there's a real inversion, where basically it is not so cool to be a scientist because you would be called a nerd. And this starts in middle school to high school. And so this was very different from my own personal experience in school, where we did not have the concept then. This was in the 80s, and American TV and culture hadn't quite penetrated, so this idea of nerds hadn't reached India. And so it was very curious for me going to college there to see that it was a completely different experience in middle school and high school. And, but then I saw the actual, the image that is used for these STEM fields is that of a pipeline that gets narrower and narrower the higher you go in sort of academic standing.
Yeah, can we talk a little bit about this pipeline? Because why is it that when you're looking at the undergraduate level, it's a much more equal mix of men and women in science, technology, engineering fields, but as you go higher and higher, as you said, there seems to be this squeeze. Is this voluntary? I assume it's not voluntary. So what's going on over there?
Yeah, it's not all voluntary. So in certain subjects, so for example, in biological sciences, you find that the undergraduates are sort of even by gender, and then it really constricts as well. And in biology in particular, a lot of the women do drop out and move to work in industry, right? So there's always been this argument that's been made, either that women opt out or they go work in industry. That's only true for the biological sciences, where, for example, in the United States and in Europe, you actually have very good research laboratories that are in the corporate world. That is not so for physics. And so obviously, right, this is an age-old argument about nature versus nurture, and it's the culture of these disciplines, the academic culture of these disciplines.
So as somebody in this culture, can you unpack this a little bit more? What is it about the culture that seems to be so hostile to women?
So I think what it is the way in which you engage and what it is believed that you need to be successful. So it is believed that you have to be aggressive, and you have to be competitive, and it is so hostile because of that style that a lot of people, a lot of women, as well as some men who don't naturally adapt to that culture, don't feel comfortable. So there's a lot of attrition because of that. And also, at the institutional level, I know from studying Yale very carefully for about 2 decades or so, that in terms of the promotional the process of promotions and tenure and so on, there's a lot of implicit bias. So you no longer have sort of the overt sexism that you probably had 30 years ago, 25 years ago, but now it's subtle, and it's very subtle in the sense that it's mediated by culture, and it goes under the moniker of implicit bias. And we all are, men and women, we all are, everyone who's embedded in culture basically has these biases.
Let me get Sharon in at this point. Sharon, perhaps you could also talk a little bit about implicit bias, but I also wanted to ask you about what the gender ratio is for British and French literature, because we worry a lot about, there not being enough women in science, but are we equally concerned about men in the arts, and should we be?
I want to start out by saying that although we might want to back away a bit from some of the stereotypes embedded in the panel title, that the arts are associated with women and the sciences with men, that from a historical perspective, that's real progress. Because 150 years ago, the debate was about whether women could contribute to anything. As someone who works on the 19th century in England and France, I've had to read so many 19th century arguments by extremely serious scholarly people, the majority of them men, writing for journals, for magazines, writing books devoted to the notion that no woman could ever contribute anything important in any sphere and should just confine herself entirely to taking care of children. And even John Stuart Mill, who is a hero, who before most men of his time and place thought women could vote and have rights, has a long discussion in his feminist work, The Subjection of Women, written around 1860, in which he says, well, there really haven't been any women geniuses in arts. There haven't been any great women musicians. There haven't been any great women painters. Cooks. So to be in a time and place where we can say, well, can women only really contribute in academia to the arts and humanities is actually, again, enormous progress. Women in the United States couldn't really attend college until the 1880s, and it wasn't until the 1970s that we saw the serious entry of women into the doctoral pool and then into the professoriate in the humanities. So the numbers are interesting in the humanities. I'm not going to speak only about French and British literature. As the humanities dean, I see the numbers for the division. In the sciences, what we tend to see at the level of professors is that about 30% of science professors are female and PhDs, about 30% of PhDs in the sciences are female and 70% male. And then how a university sees that reflected in its faculty has a lot to do with whether or not the university makes a concerted effort to have its faculty represent the pipeline. So at Columbia in the last several years, we have offered a lot of push and pull incentives to departments and also a lot of education to departments saying, you could have 30% of your faculty be women. Why don't you? Do you want to have a conversation about what the reasons might be? In the humanities, the pipeline has about 70% of PhDs, and this is obviously averaging out different fields, so it's higher in some fields, lower in others. It's about 70% of the PhDs in the humanities are women, and 30% are men. But by the time you look at the full professors on a faculty, about 70% are men and 30% are women. Now, I think it's a very taboo thing to ask, so I'm going to ask it because I believe in asking the hard questions. Are the men just better? Sometimes I have found anecdotally that men who are drawn to fields that are coded very female, they have to have a lot of motivation to do it, and sometimes it's because they really are extremely gifted at it. And so there's a very small group where you could say for a man to go into something as girly as English literature, he's got to be really great at it. But it's certainly, if you're looking across the board, I've been teaching 20, 25 years, I don't see gender differences in the truly gifted and brilliant. I've had truly gifted and brilliant male students, truly gifted and brilliant female students. I don't see significant numerical disparities. So then you have to ask, now I'll go to implicit bias and wrap it up, so we want to hear from everybody. Why is it that we see this basic inversion, that from 70% of female PhDs we get to 30% of female full professors? And I'm talking about top research universities when I talk about the numbers for full professors, but I think it's not that different at other kinds of institutions. Well, I think that there are a lot of perceptions that tend to work in favor of men and disfavor women. There are studies that show that letters of recommendation for female students, so first of all, there's certain things you should never do. I assume we have some academics here and you probably all know this already, but when you are talking about your students in letters of recommendation, you should never discuss their appearance, you should not discuss their physical manners. Okay, so I don't see a lot of that. People got that memo a while ago. But I still will see letters that talk about women as disciplined, hardworking, pleasant, And then I see many more letters for men that describe them as brilliant, imaginative, competitive.
And leaders.
And leaders. You see a lot of letters for women that focus almost exclusively on what they have actually accomplished and achieved, which I think is a good thing. You see a lot of letters for men that focus on what they've achieved and then go on for a paragraph with speculations about their promise and what they might do in the future, which we have no way of knowing if they will do. So if you take these letters, and I as a rhetorician and an analyst of language, you can see that they talk about the pipeline narrowing. In these letters of recommendation, you can see how implicit bias works to separate women and men so that men start to just seem and look so much more brilliant, and women start to seem and look so much more pedestrian and ordinary, when in fact their records may be very, very similar. So I think people need to educate themselves about implicit bias, and I think that departments in their hiring practices need to bring in consultants, because there's reams of research on how to address these issues and how to remediate them, and people need to educate themselves. I heard Stefan in an earlier panel actually on happiness talk about how the brain is extremely plastic. And that's true of male brains, and it's true of female brains, and it's very important to note that the bias against women is something perpetrated by both men and women. And as intellectuals in the academy, we always hope that awareness of something will help us be more flexible, train our brains to be different, and learn to see more clearly ourselves and others.
I think we do need to discuss how it's possible to design academic processes to help overcome implicit bias better. So, but let's get back to that, because I want to get to my right-hand side as well. I'll begin with Uday. So do you think that it's just a question of it being difficult for women in academics, period, whether it's the sciences, whether it's the humanities, and that some of this is just standard, work-life balance issues that tend to affect all careers and place and a sort of unfair and asymmetrical burden on carers of small children or carers of the elderly in general? Somebody has to do this. This is the traditional role of women. Academics can be very brutal. And so this is not something that's particularly specific to one field rather than the other, but something that's kind of we see across the board in academia, something that we see in disciplines everywhere.
I suspect there are aspects of this that are quite across the board. That is, even though I happen to have a 6-year-old child, and, I like to think that my wife and I, share the burden of responsibility equally, perhaps in different ways. I may be wrong there, but I like to think that. If she were here, I'm not sure what she'd say, but I'm sure there is an aspect of it that is quite broad. But I do think what Sharon was saying about implicit bias probably works more in certain disciplines. I mean, I remember when I went to graduate school in philosophy, and there were 6 of us in the incoming class. There was one woman, and on the first or second day of the first seminar we were taking, this woman said something in seminar, and the professor said, her name was Sharon, "Sharon, what's the argument you're making?" And she was flummoxed. I don't think said a word for the rest of the semester. It was simply
shuts you down.
It was being asked to say what she wanted to say in this language of an argument that felt like demanding of her to speak in a particular way that she didn't want to speak in. Had the professor said, "So what's the insight here?" the response may have been utterly different. But by using this very specific term, what's the argument, I think, it felt like a burden.
But if that question had been asked to a man,
Yes.
do you think the man wouldn't have reacted to it in the same way? Is it appropriate to ask a man, what's your argument, and that's fine? Or you think that question wouldn't have been asked to a man altogether because it would have been seen as disrespectful?
No, look, I think the word argument in philosophy carries a lot of weight. Okay? I mean, at some level, what philosophers are meant to do or fashion themselves as doing is constructing complex arguments. And an argument is meant to be some kind of complicatedly linked way of presenting knowledge. So just having an insight is not an argument. You have to structure it in a particular way.
Sorry, you're not answering the question of whether you think this would have been asked of a man, or whether a man would have taken it like a man, or whether this would have been inappropriate.
So for all of us entering a philosophy PhD program, we were all intimidated by this term at some level. I mean, it was the way in which this was a form of education. You had to construct arguments. It wasn't just good enough to be smart. You had to say something in a particular way. It was like being told, well, translate that into Japanese. Well, it's tough, So I think it was intimidating to all of us. It certainly was to me. But I think there was something kind of special, and I can still recall that classmate of mine not opening her mouth. As it turns out, she has gone on to become a very distinguished philosopher. But at that point, it certainly constrained her.
Moving on to the science writers, let's talk about science fiction. Why is it that so many boys read science fiction that, although literature tends to be something that's associated quite a lot, with both genders, women definitely, science fiction still seems to be a very sort of pubescent boy thing, or not. You do have some big names who are women in science fiction writing. I think off the top of my head of Ursula Le Guin and perhaps even Margaret Atwood, but it tends to be dominated by men for boys. Would you agree with this? Is this a terribly inaccurate statement to be making?
Is this working? Yeah. Well, it might be the acoustics or my... Yeah? Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, it may be the acoustics of this place or my aging ears, but most of what they said, I couldn't hear properly. So I'm going to go back a little to your argument about your opening statement about planets. You mentioned all excepting one planet in particular. So I have been an arts and science editor for a newspaper owned by the Times of India group. So obviously, if I'm covering arts and science, I'm neither from Venus or Mars. I must be the only guy here from Earth. Right? Okay, having said that, I think...
I can't hear him. We can't hear you, actually.
We can't. We have a problem. Please, sound engineer, help us.
You can't hear at all? Yeah, that's what was happening to me.
It's extremely muffled, so if the sound engineer can do something about it, but also, Mukul, just go ahead. We'll have to try, yeah.
Huh? So
we'll have to try to they can hear you, the audience can hear you. Yeah, so go ahead.
They can hear? Yeah. Anyway, having said that, your question was on science fiction. Why men write science fiction?
Would you agree with the can you hear me? Would you agree with the postulation that science fiction tends to be sort of written by men for boys?
Science fiction
is written by men for boys.
No, I don't think so. Why should they? I mean, how do you start writing saying this is for girls, this page is for boys?
Well, there's a lot of that in publishing, in terms of, publishing is very gendered. Often when you write a book, it's marketed specifically or certainly with a bias towards girl readers or boy readers, particularly when they're young. If you look at young adult fiction and children's fiction, it tends to be hugely gendered.
Well, it is, but for instance, when I've written science fiction, almost most of my protagonists have been female. So I don't think what the publishers are wanting my protagonist, to be male. Because to me, it doesn't make a difference whether it's a male or a female protagonist. Neither does it make a difference whether my readers are female or male. Though I do know that males have more buying power, that's not the fault of females. It's like saying, a man might have a little more money. I'm not saying that's good or bad, it's just it's a fact. But I would also say that science fiction has some very, very fine female writers, extremely well known. But the thing is that it's like Ada Lovelace was one of the first computer programmers. But that's because her father, who was Lord Byron, told her to go into mathematics. So here's an artist telling her daughter, his daughter, an illegitimate daughter too, at that, to go into science. Well, what was
I'm
at
sorry,
that
I
time?
just have to correct a fact here that Lord Byron had very little to do with his daughter's upbringing, and she was brought up by her mother. But she was encouraged to pursue math, but not by her father,
Okay,
who wasn't very good at math either.
I couldn't hear that. Tell me. What to then?
It's fine. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm historically correct, right? Just nod.
No, the claim was
No, just go ahead. Because we're short on time and we have to get Stefan in as well. So please continue.
No. Am I not historically correct?
Pallavi is saying you should just continue with your point.
I'll tell you later.
Okay. Do that.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, I know. I can't hear you either. So I was saying, to go back a little, we can't say from the dawn of civilization, we can't, for instance, to take the focus of this talk, can't say that hunter-gatherers are from Mars and cave makers are from Venus. They're both just as important. But it so happens that from there, in an evolutionary streak, this has continued. So, mathematics is somehow like hunter-gathering, or science is somehow like hunter-gathering, and poetry, literature, and arts are probably homemakers, right? Which is not true. I know, I agree with that. But to not recognize the fact that that's where it began is, I think, to miss a beginning point, an origination. So it's probably from that, we shouldn't rely on that today at all, but we should keep that in mind.
Great, Mukul. If I can now bring Stefan in, thank you. And sort of following on from your point, so let's look at this kind of controversial question, which is difficult to address, which has to do with whether or not there are evolutionary or inherent differences in the average male and female brain that affect somehow their ability in different fields. Is there any sort of science behind the lack of women in science, as it were?
Well, can you hear me? Okay, so the answer was, is there any science to explain the lack of women in science? And the answer is not really. There is no thing like a male or a female brain. We have been knowing this for a long time, at least for 30 years or something like that. Our male brains are bigger than female brains, but so are our bodies. In some
However, Stefan, sorry, but you said so are our bodies, but men are stronger, therefore. So having bigger brains makes them more intelligent? I mean, does it?
No, it doesn't. Look, there are some very isolated fields where you find significant differences, and those are few, mind you, few. The strongest difference you'd find between so-called male and so-called female brain is special abilities. That is, rotate that thing in your head 3 times and tell me what it looks like. Okay? What is found is that men, in average, perform better than women do. But in average, we perform better than you. In
Visual
spatial thinking. Now, this doesn't tell you well, this is just a fact, and it's been shown in many but not all cultures. But this does not tell you if this is innate or is it a cultural influence. And there have been extreme, well, first, one, I'll come back to that. Second, these are bell curves, and the average is different slightly, which is not to say that there are many more gifted women in spatial rotation than the average man. Yeah? This doesn't explain, because the difference in average, the variation is much huger than the difference in average. So, how about a cultural influence on that? There has been, a couple of years ago, been a lovely paper on that, with experiment being done in the Indian northeastern hill states. And they have tribal people there who are matrilinear, that is, the women have the power or the inheritance, which, as a consequence, the women get the same education as men, at least the same education as men, and they have nearby tribes which are patrilineal, okay, where the men have the power. Now, wonder what do they find? They find in the matrilineal, people, you would not find a significant difference. Now, my very strong suspicion is, and it's a very strong suspicion, that there is an innate slight difference. It has probably to do with exposure to testosterone in the womb. But that afterwards, that very tiny difference gets boosted through society. And I tell you an example from my experience. Now look, I have 3 children. My wife is trained as a mechanical engineer, so one would not suspect us to have strong implicit biases. Now, what does our second daughter, who is very bright in mathematics, what does she tell me when coming home from school? Hey, come on, math is not a kind of girl thing. And I said, who is telling you that? Well, that's what they are talking to each other in the schoolyard. And that's the peer group. That's the peer group which amplifies it. And it makes me cross. And I think when talking about such issues, reducing biases in academia is fine and is important. But I strongly want to make a claim that we have to begin much, much earlier.
But you know, there is research that's shown that, like what you were saying, that there are some kind of innate differences when they get exposed to school. I mean, newborn girls prefer to look at faces, I believe, and newborn boys tend to prefer looking at mechanical stimuli like mobiles. When it comes to toys, is this not true? I have found
these studies have very few statistics, right? So I think there are lots of studies that are somewhat suspect. I think the point which is true, I mean, riffing on, continuing what Stefan said, that when you look at the variation in abilities, there's a huge spread. There are a lot more male outliers at the high end and the low end, if you look at mathematical ability, spatial ability, as well as verbal ability, right? I think the tricky thing here is that experience alters the brain structures and functioning. And we know that. We know that extremely well, right? And we know that, you can't therefore make any easy causal statements between gender and any activity, right?
But
Well, I'd also like to return to Uday's anecdote and what it tells us, and connect it to this idea of experience affects the brain and what people are told about what they can and can't do. Because there are just so many ways in which women are discouraged, girls are discouraged from doing certain things, and boys are discouraged from doing certain things, that at the age of 4 or 5, when gender identity becomes a real obsession with children, there may be a way that they track at that age that is very, very hard for them to get over. And you know, for example, let's take an example of I have to talk out of the US context because that's what I know. So let's say a boy who's very interested in ballet. He might be mercilessly mocked by his fellows, male and female, boys and girls, for being interested in a girly thing. Perhaps he could have gone on to become the next Baryshnikov, but he may decide, forget it. I don't want to deal with the hassle. You have girls, by and large, are verbally well ahead of boys. This is, again, in the United States, it's widely observed. I don't know if it's always been true, but they acquire language much earlier. They're much more verbally adept. Why doesn't that turn into a competitive advantage that builds and builds and builds over time? Well, if you have experiences in which you're put into an environment that doesn't really, it's not designed for your way of being. Girls are taught to be considerate of others, not too aggressive, not too assertive.
And to be liked.
And to be liked.
And likable.
And they don't necessarily absorb that teaching all the time. I know many very, very assertive women, but let's say you're very good at philosophy, but you know, you're not a talker, you're more of a writer, and then you show up in this classroom and someone says to you, what argument are you making? You freeze. The effect of freezing in that way may make it very hard for you to ever climb back. I'm delighted to hear that professor made it, but I just think that we have gifts and then we have our ability to access our gifts. And our experiences sometimes make it very, very hard for us to operate at the best of our abilities and then for that to keep building and building. Instead, we spiral down.
Right.
Wait, no, let Stefan jump in here for a second.
You say they are taught some gender identities or some gender preferences, if you want to put it thus. And what I think the reality is much more unsettling. And what really disturbs me is that they teach themselves. In the peer group, we know that the peer group influence is way stronger than what any parent and what any teacher could tell them. And why I find this so disturbing is because it makes it all the harder to change these preconceptions.
But where do you think those was it boys who said this to your daughter, or was it girls who said it? Where did they get that idea that boys do math but girls don't? Where did that come from?
Culture, right? It's everywhere around you.
It's everywhere, exactly, and they amplify it.
I have small boys. The girls, all of them, princesses, Barbies. The boys, all of them, Jedi Knights. I mean, without exception. And when I had 2 boys, I was quite disappointed. I always wanted girls because I wanted to bring them up as feminists. So when I had boys, I sort of comforted myself by telling myself, oh, they'll be feminists, they'll just be boys. By the time my elder one was, 1 year old, I bought them dolls. I, had visions of one of them one day sort of sitting and crocheting. No interest, so much so that he changed me. So by the time he was 1.5 years old, I had to learn about heavy machinery and diggers and dumper trucks and the difference between this ridiculous, variety of trucks, essentially, and things that move, rather than him having learned from me. And this happened preschool, when he had no peer group, which is what really flummoxed me.
No, but I mean, I think it's not just, this is not very structured learning. They absorb stuff from the environment, even in the way in which parents talk to their children. They're a lot more verbal. So there are a couple of psychologists at Yale, Karen Wynn notably, works on infants, and she finds that the ways in which parents engage with their girl infants and their boy infants is different. And so you get these things started in very, very invisible ways, right? And then they later on get amplified. Now, I just wanted to make one more point. I wanted to connect up to the point that Uday had made about by the time you come to graduate school. So I've been teaching at Yale now for 13 years, and I teach an undergraduate class for non-science majors. And the enrollment is 50-50. but there is a real sharp gendered difference in how people react to success and failure. So I give a test, right? And the girl kids who don't do well come to me and they say, oh, professor, maybe I should drop this class. Maybe I can't do this, right? And the boy kids who don't do well come to my office hours and say, well, professor, you know, that question, that was ambiguous. So, you know, your test was not quite right, and that's why I didn't do so well. So, I mean, I've noticed this over 10 years. Actually, I'm keeping the data. So there's a way in which we have gendered even notions of success and failure.
So this is also cultural, the fact that women react differently to failure or success, this is cultural as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
You think? Yeah.
I would say, I mean, I observe, well, I would say both of your sets of students are reacting very poorly to doing badly on a test, because criticizing the test is not a good response. The ideal response is to say, I didn't do well, how can I do better?
Right.
And I do, I have not been collecting data. We're not talking about numbers in the thousands, but numbers in the hundreds. But again, getting back to this anecdote, I do see men that I encounter as graduate students and even as junior faculty much more prepared to deal with failure by not taking it personally and just trying again, and understanding that if you apply for 50 things, you have a much better chance of getting it. And I do see women much more likely, if they get turned down, to say, oh, I must be doing something wrong, I'm not going to do this anymore. But I think that, again, this is something we can help our students with. I think sometimes male students are overconfident in ways that don't serve them well. And I always talk to students about, we're all on a volume button. And some of us need to turn the volume up because our natural volume is too low, we're being too timid, we're coming across as too diffident. And some of us need to turn the volume down because we're overconfident, we're coming across too strong.
So let's talk about possible solutions and designs.
No, can I just make one?
Yes.
Just one
Can
point?
I-
Sorry. Yes, of course, go ahead.
Yeah, this was that, see, there's some way where we can go ahead, I feel. That is because I was, my father was in the army, so when I was growing up and I was 4 or 5 years old, he taught me how to fire a rifle. My mother got pretty cheesed off with that and told me, you have to learn sewing and knitting, which I do know. Now this has really helped me because I have 3 daughters now. And I have taught them not only sewing and knitting, but also firing a rifle. Now, one of my daughters, who probably is here, is a filmmaker. And I told her that you probably don't know about how much science is required in filmmaking. So I told her about science again, and I said, listen, physics is very important, just as important as your knitting is, because she knits very well. So I think that mindset, which is not something that I am claiming I was born with, but which was given to me possibly serendipitously by my parents, has worked. Right. So that's probably a model we should adopt for our children.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, you know, it starts very young, and it starts in the home before you go to school, preschool, anything. Absolutely.
I've been told that we should open this up a little bit, because much as I have an array of burning questions to ask and want to keep you all to myself, we should share you with our lovely audience as well. And we do only have around 12 minutes left. So could I see some hands, please? There's a hand right in front, raised tall. Please state who you are and who the question is directed to.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Can you hear? Thanks. Wonderful panel. I'm Jo Puri. I'm an economist, and I teach at Columbia, and and I've studied in the US for a long period of time. So my question is actually to Sharon, but also to Priyamvada and perhaps anyone else, is that could you talk a little bit about expectation and how culture and ethnicity might be confounding perhaps some of the takeaways that you're mixing with the role of gender. I went to graduate school, and I know that I was picked and I was told, oh, you're Asian, you must be really good at math, right? So aggression, intellect, likability, etc., all of them get confounded with your aptitude and your genius? And could you sort of untangle those a little? Thanks.
Sure. Well, certainly, that's a very important point. And certainly in the United States, there are all kinds of ethnic stereotypes and racial stereotypes that also play into how people are perceived. There is certainly this notion that, I mean, I think a more apt panel would have been, are Asians only good at math but never at the humanities? I have many gifted students who are of various Asian ethnicities who are great at the humanities, and they have had people say, faculty who should know better, say the most ridiculous things to them. I'm also going, I'm not sure this is quite what you're asking, but I'm going to just raise one other issue because no one has mentioned it yet, and I think it's important if we think about the ways that there are fewer and fewer women the higher you go up the ladder in academia. I have friends who are younger than I am and friends who are 25 years older than I am who have told me almost identical stories of being in graduate school, singled out by a very charismatic male mentor who then, pretty early in their graduate educations, told them that he was in love with them, that he wanted to be in a relationship with them. Often these men were married, but that didn't stop them. And when the women said, no, I don't want to do that, were extremely vindictive and basically hounded them out of graduate school. One woman didn't pursue an academic career, the other did and was very successful. But these are not, on the basis of my experience talking to people, this is not the norm. But it is something that happens, and it has a very, very chilling effect.
Do you have anything burning to say, or should we take another question?
No, I think just want to quickly add on that I think it's the importance is of mentoring and how these particular stereotypes might sometimes be advantageous in how you get mentored, and sometimes they are greatly disadvantageous. So the fact that you might be an Asian woman who's supposed to be quantitatively gifted, whatever, might mean that it is actually easier for you to find good intellectual mentors. Because we know that for a lot of women, the gender stereotype aside, it's harder to get men who are more invested in their careers. Intellectual mentors, right? I mean, there's the problem of sexual misconduct. That's a different issue. It's a pressing issue, and in my field, it's been quite disturbing and with a lot of interesting cases that came out. But I think the mentoring is actually key, and I think, you know, the stereotypes do play in there. I mean, sometimes the mentoring, the stereotypes work in such a way that you are advantaged in terms of mentoring, and sometimes you're not. But, you know, I just want to quickly add that, I mean, economics along with physics has some of the worst statistics in the United States, for sure, for women.
We have a question, tall hand again.
Can you hear me? Yeah. My name is Paritosh Joshi. Now the topic was, you know, this whole Mars-Venus thing. It occurs to me that a lot of science writing that I have read, or presentations, I was listening to a presentation, Priyamvada, by Catherine Freezer about dark matter yesterday, actually uses words like harmony and balance and cadence and resonance and, you know, words from the world of aesthetics. And we've been looking at binaries here as if there is a, you know, left brain thing and a right brain thing that's going on. But I would argue, and I would put that to you, that you can't be a good scientist without being a good artist, and you can't be a good artist, as you said, without being a good scientist. So why is it that we have to do this, you know, rigid binary all the time?
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's a brilliant point, and I think that, you know, it's C.P. Snow who I think artificially made this distinction between two cultures, which has now gotten unnecessary resonance. And I absolutely agree with you that to be a physicist, not only do you have to have a sense of aesthetics, it might be a different sense of aesthetics because your language is mathematics. The language with which you express understanding and comprehension is often mathematics. But you need imagination, you need creativity, and I think this two cultures and this binarity is actually quite ridiculous. You really cannot be a successful intellectual. You can't have a life of the mind without melding the so-called two cultures. That's a really good point.
I'd like to add that the reason that we're doing this is because not everyone is Da Vincian. so that we can't have arts and science easily melding with each other in every person. But the thing is that the time has come when we should try to be, at least have a goal of trying to be Da Vinci.
I will come to you, but first you at the back.
Hello. 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 First of all, thank you, the panel. My name is Sarvain. I'm a consultant for experiential learning. I work a lot with students, both boys and girls, in villages and in...
Sorry? You work a lot with?
Students, boys and girls in villages and in metros. And I've seen quite similarity in them. So I fail to recognize who makes these benchmarks. What is the expectations? We as in the society, as parents, as teachers, we set up the benchmark seeing each other. Isn't each individual, I find them very, very different, and each is capable in his own way.
Do you have a specific question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why is this, I feel there shouldn't be much expectations. To be normal is to be natural, and to be natural is to be normal. And accordingly, we should try and let them grow without specifying.
Okay, I think that's more of a comment. Any more questions? Yes, go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Imran Merchant. I'm based in Bombay. I wish to take a look at this context from the other end of the telescope just now. I have noticed that for the first time in 24 hours, the main topic and the theme of the Litfest of this year has been brought back into focus, which is that man-woman thing. So I noticed that today on the stage we've got 3 males over there and 3 females. Yes. This is my question. In the context of how do the males and the female respond to situations differently?
Is the question for anyone in
I'm coming to the question now. I'm framing the question. This may sound a little bit frivolous. It's a hypothesis. This is my question. If the members of this particular panel were to find themselves in a position of great power in their own societies and countries, how would they respond? What is the first thing they would feel that they should change?
Okay, let's have a quick round. You know, one solution, and so on, all the way down, starting with Mukul.
One thing that I feel we should change is we should make all parents forget what sex they are.
Great, that's very snappy. Uday.
I have no idea what I change.
We'll ask Stefan. Go ahead.
Well, I try to take steps against the waste of any talent. I think we are wasting lots of talent, not only of women, but also of young people who are socio-economically disfavored, and we can't afford to do so any longer.
But how? I mean, the question.
How?
Like a concrete thing. If you were in a position of power and you had the ability to change something that would help address the issue you've just pointed out, what would that be?
Right, okay. One thing I would definitely start with, making teachers aware of, teachers and kindergarten educators aware of implicit biases of all kinds.
Sharon.
I would change the tax structure so that there would be greater redistribution of income, not as much disparity, and I would impose higher taxes on any institution where you could demonstrate that there were great disparities in pay by ethnicity and gender, so that they would have an incentive to make sure that minorities, so-called minorities and women, were paid more.
Priyamvada?
Yeah, I think in the context of the university setting, what I would actually do is also ensure that the promotion processes that we have in place now are once again departments, similar to what Sharon said, but act locally so that departments have incentives to make sure that there's no gender pay gap within the departments. I think everything has to sort of filter up, as well as their promotion rates, and be aware of, just make it, we know that just being aware of implicit bias makes a real difference. And the pitch I want to make is for science departments. Science departments are particularly difficult because scientists believe that they are highly objective, that their work is so objective. So it's very easy to judge what's right and what's wrong, and therefore they are above bias. So I think I would like the science departments at universities to be incentivized to actually take on board and mitigate bias by being aware of it.
Any more questions?
We cannot
Yes, go ahead.
Ma'am, we're running.
We have 5 minutes, no? Isn't it till
3:45.
3:45? We're 3:42. So 3 more minutes. Come on, there's another question here. Go on.
Thank you.
Last
It's
question.
always nice to be the last person to speak. Just wondering, speaking of solutions and systemic designs, how we all speak of empowerment and, positive affirmations. How does that work, in favor of people? So whenever someone gets a promotion, it's often seen as favoritism or bias instead of rewarding their merit. So how would that sexism would be tackled at workspaces, being more...
Do you have the question for anyone in particular?
Anyone who would love to
Anyone
answer.
would like to take that?
Well, I mean, I think that part of the reward structures, for example, is because, so if you look again, I'm talking very much in the context of science, right? You see that in the grants process, there's a lot of bias, right? So one solution would be to make the processes where you hand out grants and so on to be anonymous. So you don't have names, you don't have gender, right? Gender is not coded in. And that way, it would really be the work. You would actually move towards a true meritocracy, because we now believe that we are in meritocracies in these universities, and we really aren't. I mean, I think that's, so that would be one way to...
I want to second that. Malcolm Gladwell in Blink tells a story about a conductor who really truly believed that women could not play music as well as men, in particular that they were not as aggressive and energetic. And he was finally convinced to conduct rehearsals where the players sat behind a screen, and then the numbers became 50%, which I wouldn't necessarily expect, and I do think that there has to be a recognition of different styles. It's important to recognize that all the institutions that women enter now were almost exclusively created by men for men, and that there needs to be, if we get back to the question of balance and harmonizing, there needs to be some willingness to not only tolerate but embrace diversity of personal styles. But at the same time, we have a lot of misconceptions about styles because we read people through a grid, and I think that more anonymity in evaluation processes would be a very salutary thing.
Uday, I think you had one last point that you wanted to make, so why don't you go ahead before we wrap up?
Partially to be polemical, but not entirely. As we speak about implicit bias, I wonder, would we or would a literary festival ever have a panel devoted to the question why boys are discouraged from doing ballet?
Maybe in 50 years.
And that says something about the implicit bias here. The implicit bias here is that somehow there's something more important about science than there is about ballet, or there's something worrisome about women not doing science in a way in which I doubt if we'd be worried about men.
Well, there are transgendered issues, there are,
No, I think we are talking, he's raising an interesting structural point.
It's not a transgender issue. I'm saying we have to be self-conscious about our implicit bias, and perhaps we want to affirm that bias. Right. Perhaps we want to say, yes, ours is a society and a culture in which we want more women to do science, and recognize that as a bias. There's nothing natural about that. There's nothing natural about that.
But I think, Uday, this goes to the point that Sharon made earlier, right? That some of the spaces that we're talking about are very male spaces. They were created by men. They are seen as, they are coding power. So science, we're talking about science and women in science because science as an activity codes power, and it's a male domain, and it's about women entering that. And the reason I said 50 years, I wasn't being flippant. When we will see that we are losing talent in ballet because there are very few men who are going in to play the male parts, and there are more parts that are being written for men too, then this discussion will switch.
I think that's a fantastic note to end on. I'm sorry we can't take any more questions. Can we have a round of applause for our sterling panel? Thank you very much for being here with us this afternoon.
We thank you for being here at the Times Litfest 2016, all the panelists and our moderator. Thank you so much once again. Can we hear it for all our panelists and the moderators?
So I just wanted to quickly add as the astronomer that neither Mars nor Venus are actually hospitable for anybody, men or women.